I've been watching politics and political figures for decades now, and I thought I had seen everything. I thought I had witnessed every possible miscalculation, every strategic blunder, every self-inflicted wound that a political leader could possibly make. But what we're witnessing right now, what's unfolding before our very eyes as this year comes to a close, is something I genuinely did not anticipate. A country that was supposed to fold, that was supposed to cave, that was supposed to beg for mercy, has instead risen up and delivered one of the most devastating economic counterpunches in modern trade history. And the target of that counterpunch, the very industries that put their money behind the man who started this whole mess in the first place. This is a story about hubris, about miscalculation, and about what happens when you underestimate an entire nation of people who decided they'd had enough. Let me take you back to Christmas Day, because that's really where this whole saga began in earnest. Donald Trump, in his infinite wisdom, decided that the holiday season was the perfect time to launch an ugly, threatening attack on our closest allies. He went after Greenland, he went after Panama, and most significantly for what we're discussing today, he went after Canada. He told Canadians essentially to go to hell. He floated this absurd notion that Canada should become the 51st state. He threatened their sovereignty, their economy, their very identity as an independent nation. And what did we hear from the Republican establishment? What did we hear from Mitch McConnell, the Senate leader from Kentucky, whose own state's signature industry was about to get absolutely hammered? We heard nothing. Absolute silence. Not a single word of condemnation, not a single acknowledgement that perhaps threatening one of our largest trading partners during the holiday season might not be the most strategically sound decision. I've said it before and I'll say it again. Donald Trump fundamentally does not understand how human beings work. He operates under this bizarre assumption that bullying people, threatening them, pushing them around will somehow make them respect you and want to do business with you. It's the mindset of a schoolyard bully who's genuinely confused when nobody shows up to his birthday party. You can't threaten people into friendship. You can't intimidate nations into favorable trade deals. At some point, and this is what Trump has never grasped, people push back. They organize, they find alternatives. And that's exactly what happened with Canada. The Canadian people, furious at being treated like some vassal state, responded with what's being described as the largest consumer boycott in living memory. They didn't need their government to tell them what to do. They didn't need legislation or formal trade barriers. They simply stopped buying American products. Now, here's where it gets really interesting and where Trump's complete inability to think three moves ahead becomes glaringly apparent. The Canadian boycott didn't target American products randomly. It was strategic, it was focused, and it hit industries that had traditionally supported Republican candidates and Trump specifically. The bourbon industry, the wine industry, sectors that had poured money into Republican campaigns suddenly found themselves facing an existential crisis. This wasn't an accident. This was a coordinated response designed to make the people who enabled Trump feel the consequences of their political choices. And let me tell you, those consequences have been devastating. We're talking about a $9 billion industry in Kentucky alone that is now in free fall. Jim Beam, one of the most iconic names in American spirits, is shutting down its main distillery for the entirety of next year. This is a facility that has been in continuous operation since 1935. 1,500 unionized workers are now facing uncertainty about their futures. And for what? For Donald Trump's ego? The excuses coming out of the bourbon industry have been almost comical in their desperation. They're claiming the shutdown is for site enhancements. They're talking about a glut of whiskey on the market, which is particularly amusing when you consider that production this year was already down 55 million gallons compared to last year. If you're producing dramatically less and still claiming there's a glut, something else is clearly going on. They're blaming changes in youth drinking habits, as if millennials and Gen Z suddenly decided en masse to stop drinking bourbon in the span of a few months. The Kentucky newspapers, to their credit, aren't buying any of it. They're telling readers to talk to Canada if they want to understand what's really happening to their state's signature industry. The fact is, and this is the number that should terrify anyone in the American spirits business, the United States has lost 85% of its bourbon export market to Canada this year. 85%. That's not a downturn. That's not a correction. That's a complete market collapse. What makes this situation even more concerning for American producers is the nature of how markets actually work. Bourbon has historically been a reliable staple in restaurants and bars across Canada. Bartenders reached for Jim Beam without even thinking about it when making mixed drinks. It was automatic, reflexive, the default choice. But here's the thing about defaults. Once you break that habit, once you force people to find alternatives, they often discover they like those alternatives just as much or even better. I've been hearing reports from people in the Canadian restaurant industry who have been exploring Canadian whiskeys, Irish whiskeys, and other spirits they never would have considered before. Their customers are responding positively. Some are actually preferring the new options. And critically, Canadian consumers want to know what's in their glass now. They're actively rejecting American bourbon on principle. That market share, once it's gone, doesn't just automatically come back when the political situation changes. Consumer habits are sticky, and brand loyalty, once broken, is incredibly difficult to rebuild. The cascade of damage throughout the American bourbon industry has been nothing short of remarkable to watch. Jim Beam's shutdown is just the most visible symptom of a much deeper crisis. Jack Daniel's, another iconic American brand, announced layoffs back in August, citing a 65% drop in sales to Canada. And that was before things got really bad. With the overall Canadian market now down 85%, you can only imagine what their current internal numbers look like. These are brands that have been built over generations, that have become synonymous with American culture and identity around the world. And they're being systematically dismantled by a consumer movement that Donald Trump either didn't anticipate or, more likely, never even considered as a possibility. In his mind, countries and consumers were supposed to simply accept whatever he demanded. The notion that ordinary people might have their own agency, their own ability to make choices that could impact billion-dollar industries, apparently never crossed his mind. Then there's the case of Kentucky Owl Bourbon, which declared bankruptcy in October. This story really illustrates just how thoroughly the Canadian boycott has devastated the market. When the company tried to use their barrels of aging whiskey as collateral to pay down their debts, the courts rejected the proposal. Judge Everett, after hearing testimony from market experts in the whiskey trade, issued a statement that should send chills down the spine of anyone in the industry. The judge said the testimony really brought home to the court the dismal state of the barrel market. Among the insights the court found was that it would be very challenging to sell this inventory without a considerable discount. Think about what that means. Barrels of aging whiskey, which have traditionally been considered valuable assets that appreciate over time, are now essentially worthless. You couldn't give them away. The entire secondary market for bourbon has collapsed. This isn't just about one company or one brand. This is about the fundamental economics of an entire industry being upended. Let me put this in some historical context because I think it's important to understand just how dramatic this reversal has been. 10 years ago, American whiskey was experiencing what seemed like an endless boom. The export market was expanding rapidly, new distilleries were opening, investment was pouring into the industry. Market analysts were writing reports about how there was no end in sight to the growth. American bourbon had become a global phenomenon, a point of pride, a symbol of American craftsmanship and tradition. All of that is now gone, finished, destroyed by the ego of one man who thought he could bully an entire nation into submission. And the companies that supported him, that funded his campaigns and enabled his rise, are now paying the price. As my late father used to say, you get what you pay for. Suntory Holdings, which owns Jim Beam, Beam Global Spirits and Wine, and Maker's Mark Distillery, made clear choices in 2020 about where they were going to put their political investments. In the Senate races, they supported Republicans. In the House races, they supported Republicans. Well, they got their Republicans. And now their market is in free fall. There's a certain poetic justice to it. What's particularly galling about all of this is the complicity of the American political class. They watched a convicted predator, a con man, a man whose business career was sustained by money flowing through Russian shell companies and dark money connections. And they said nothing. They enabled him. They protected him. They refused to speak out even when he threatened our allies on Christmas Day. And now, when the consequences of his actions are destroying American jobs and American industries, where are they? Mitch McConnell represents Kentucky. His state is being economically devastated by Trump's trade war. 1,500 union jobs are on the line at Jim Beam alone, and yet McConnell remains silent. He said nothing when Trump threatened Canada, and he's saying nothing now as his own constituents pay the price. This is the Republican Party in 2024. They will watch their own states burn before they'll utter a single word of criticism against Donald Trump. Meanwhile, the contrast with Canada could not be more stark. The Canadian economy is actually performing remarkably well, despite, or perhaps because of, the trade war Trump initiated. They added 54,000 new jobs last month, the third consecutive month of job growth. Unemployment is at a 16-month low. Banking analysts are saying the last time Canada saw this kind of improvement in unemployment numbers was during the tech boom of 1999. Let me say that again so it really sinks in. Canada, the country that was supposed to be crushed by Trump's economic war, is experiencing job growth that hasn't been seen since the dot-com boom. Meanwhile, in the United States, there's increasing insecurity about jobs, a worsening affordability crisis that Trump dismisses as a hoax, and entire industries being brought to their knees. Governor Andy Beshear of Kentucky, one of the few elected officials willing to speak honestly about what's happening, said he's been deeply disappointed by Trump's falsehoods on the affordability issue. He called it a slap in the face to the people of Kentucky. He said he wants Kentuckians and Americans to know that he's listening to them and that he's surprised but not shocked that Trump still doesn't get it. The fundamental problem, and this is something I've been saying about Trump for years now, is that he simply doesn't understand how any of this works. He thinks trade wars are like his business dealings, where he can threaten and bluster, and eventually people will cave. He doesn't understand that nations have pride, that citizens have agency, that consumers can make choices that bypass government negotiations entirely. The Canadian government doesn't need to formally retaliate against American bourbon. They don't need to impose tariffs or trade barriers. All they need is for their citizens to continue doing exactly what they're already doing, which is refusing to buy American products. And Donald Trump can't negotiate his way out of that. He can't bully individual consumers. He can't threaten people into buying Jim Beam. The Canadian boycott has demonstrated something profound about the limits of economic coercion. When you push people too far, when you insult their nation and threaten their sovereignty, they push back in ways that you can't control. Trump is reportedly demanding, as part of the ongoing USMCA negotiations, that Canada restore American alcohol to store shelves. The sheer audacity of this demand really tells you everything you need to know about how this man thinks. He bullied, he threatened, he insulted, he told an entire nation to go to hell, and now he's demanding that they go back to buying American products as if none of that happened. As if you can treat people like garbage and then expect them to be your loyal customers. Maybe he can pressure the Canadian federal government. Maybe he can twist arms in the provincial capitals. But here's what he can't do. And this is the crucial point. He cannot force individual Canadian citizens to buy bourbon. He cannot make people put Jim Beam in their shopping carts. He cannot compel bartenders to stock American whiskey. The power of the consumer boycott is that it exists entirely outside the realm of government negotiation. Even if Justin Trudeau signed a trade deal tomorrow that Trump claimed as a total victory, it wouldn't change a thing on the ground. Canadians are not buying American products, and no trade agreement can force them to. This is what happens when you govern through intimidation and threats. Eventually, people figure out that they don't actually have to comply. The American political class seems to have forgotten that our economic power depends, in large part, on people wanting to buy American products. We're not a command economy. We can't order foreign consumers to purchase our goods. Our economic relationships with other nations are based at their foundation on mutual benefit and at least a baseline level of mutual respect. Donald Trump threw all of that out the window when he started treating our allies like enemies. He seemed to think that because America is big and powerful, other countries had no choice but to accept whatever treatment he decided to dish out. He was wrong. They have choices, they're exercising those choices, and American workers are paying the price for his arrogance. I want to talk a bit about the targeting strategy behind the Canadian boycott because I think it demonstrates a level of sophistication that has been underestimated. This wasn't random. This wasn't just general anti-American sentiment expressing itself through consumer behavior. The boycott specifically targeted industries that had political connections to Trump and the Republican Party. Bourbon is produced primarily in Kentucky, represented by Mitch McConnell. Wine industry interests tend to support Republican candidates. These aren't coincidental targets. The Canadian public, either through grassroots organization or simply through collective intuition, figured out how to make the people who enabled Trump feel the consequences of their choices. If you want Republican politicians to abandon Trump, you have to make their donors hurt. And that's exactly what's happening. The bourbon industry donated to Republicans, and now they're watching their market collapse. The political calculus has to be changing in those boardrooms. Supporting Trump used to be a safe bet for business interests. It's not looking so safe anymore. The long-term implications of this trade war extend far beyond bourbon. What we're witnessing is a fundamental realignment of consumer preferences that will reshape markets for years, possibly decades to come. When Canadian restaurants and bars are forced to find alternatives to American spirits, they discover options they never would have explored otherwise. Canadian whiskeys, Irish whiskeys, Scotch, Japanese whiskey. There's an entire world of spirits out there. And once consumers develop a taste for these alternatives, once they become comfortable with brands they'd never tried before, they don't automatically go back to their old habits. Brand loyalty takes years to build and moments to destroy. The American bourbon industry spent generations building its reputation in Canada, creating associations with quality and authenticity and Americana. Donald Trump destroyed all of that in a matter of months. And the recovery, if it ever comes, will take just as long to rebuild. The human cost of all this cannot be overlooked. When we talk about market share and export numbers and industry collapses, we're ultimately talking about real people whose lives are being upended. Those 1,500 workers at the Jim Beam distillery didn't vote for Donald Trump's trade war. Many of them probably didn't vote for Trump at all. But they're the ones who are going to suffer the consequences when that plant shuts down next year. They're the ones who will struggle to make mortgage payments, who will worry about health care for their families, who will face an uncertain economic future because one man's ego demanded that he pick fights with our allies. This is what leadership without accountability looks like. Trump will never face any personal consequences for the damage he's caused. He'll continue living in his gilded towers, collecting his speaking fees, grifting off his political movement. But ordinary American workers, union workers in Kentucky, will pay the real price. And the Republican Party that enabled all of this will offer them nothing but thoughts and prayers. I've been practicing law and observing politics for a very long time, and if there's one thing I've learned, it's that consequences have a way of catching up to people. Donald Trump has spent his entire life escaping accountability for his actions. He stiffed contractors, defrauded customers, bankrupted businesses, and always managed to walk away relatively unscathed while others absorbed the damage. But what's happening with Canada is different. This isn't a lawsuit he can settle or a bankruptcy he can structure his way out of. This is millions of individual consumers making individual choices day after day, purchase after purchase, that are collectively devastating American industries. There's no court to manipulate, no judge to intimidate, no settlement to negotiate. The Canadian people have rendered their verdict on Donald Trump and his treatment of their nation. And that verdict is costing American businesses billions of dollars. As we reach the end of this first year of economic warfare between the United States and Canada, I find myself reflecting on what this moment represents in the broader sweep of American political history. We have witnessed something genuinely unprecedented, a situation where an American president's personal belligerence and complete inability to conduct diplomacy has resulted in a catastrophic market collapse for a signature American industry. The bourbon industry isn't just any industry. It's deeply woven into American identity, into our history, into our cultural exports to the world. When people around the globe think of America, they think of certain images, certain products, certain symbols. Bourbon is one of those symbols. And Donald Trump, through his threats and insults and general diplomatic malpractice, has managed to make that symbol toxic in the eyes of millions of Canadian consumers. This is what happens when you elect a man who fundamentally does not understand that soft power matters, that relationships matter, that how you treat people matters even in international trade. Let me be clear about something. I am not celebrating the hardship that American workers are facing. The families in Kentucky who are going to struggle because of Jim Beam's shutdown deserve better. The workers at Jack Daniels who have been laid off deserve better. The people whose livelihoods depended on Kentucky Owl bourbon before it went bankrupt deserved better. They deserved a president who understood that his words and actions have consequences that extend far beyond his own ego. They deserved Republican senators who would speak up when the president threatened our closest allies and largest trading partners. They deserved a political class that would prioritize their economic security over their own political survival. Instead, they got Donald Trump and the enablers who refused to stand up to him. And now they're paying the price for that collective failure of leadership. The comparison between the American and Canadian economies right now is genuinely stunning. Canada was supposed to collapse. That was the whole theory behind Trump's approach. Canada is a smaller economy, heavily dependent on trade with the United States. Apply enough pressure, make enough threats, and they would have no choice but to capitulate. Instead, the opposite happened. Canada stood up. The Canadian people organized the largest consumer boycott in memory. They found alternative markets and alternative suppliers, and their economy is thriving. 54,000 new jobs last month, 3 consecutive months of job growth, unemployment at a 16-month low. The banking sector is comparing current economic conditions to the tech boom of the late 90s. Canada didn't just survive Trump's economic war, they're winning it. Meanwhile, the American economy is showing increasing signs of strain. The affordability crisis that Trump dismisses as a hoax is very real to families struggling to make ends meet. Governor Andy Beshear of Kentucky represents what genuine leadership looks like in this moment. Unlike the Republicans who remain silent while their states suffer, Beshear has been willing to speak honestly about what's happening. He called out Trump's falsehoods on the affordability crisis. He called it a slap in the face to the people of Kentucky. He acknowledged that he's listening to his constituents, that he understands their struggles. And he expressed what so many of us feel, surprise but not shock, that Trump still doesn't get it. Trump has never gotten it. He's never understood that leadership involves responsibility, that words have consequences, that attacking your allies creates real damage that can't be easily repaired. The contrast between Beshear and McConnell tells you everything you need to know about the current state of American political leadership. What happens next is genuinely uncertain. Trump has shown no indication that he's learned anything from this debacle. He's still making demands, still threatening, still apparently convinced that if he just bullies hard enough, Canada will eventually submit. But the evidence suggests otherwise. The Canadian boycott shows no signs of weakening. Consumer preferences that have shifted over the past year are likely to remain shifted. The market for American bourbon in Canada may never fully recover. We're only at the end of year 1 of this economic war. What does year 2 look like? What about year 3? The damage is cumulative, and with each passing month of the boycott, the long-term consequences become more severe for American industries caught in the crossfire. I want to return, in closing, to something Charlie Angus of Midas Canada said, because I think it captures something important about this moment. He noted that in any war, certain battles and certain victories become incredibly symbolic, and nothing, he said, is more symbolic than the torching of the American bourbon economy. He's right. Bourbon represents something about America, about our history and culture and self-image. For Canada to target that industry sends a message that goes beyond economics. It says we reject what you're trying to do to us. It says we will not be intimidated. The symbolism is powerful precisely because bourbon is so quintessentially American. As I reflect on what I've witnessed this year, I keep coming back to the fundamental absurdity of it all. Donald Trump started this war. Nobody asked him to threaten Canada on Christmas Day. Nobody forced him to suggest that Canada should become the 51st state. He did this entirely on his own initiative, driven by his own ego and his own fundamental misunderstanding of how international relations work. And now American workers are paying the price. American businesses are paying the price. American communities are paying the price. The Canadian people have demonstrated something powerful through their collective action. They've shown that ordinary citizens making ordinary choices about what to buy and what not to buy can have an extraordinary impact. They simply decided as individuals and as a nation that they would not reward a bully with their consumer dollars. Canada went elbows up and they're winning. Donald Trump thought he could break Canada. Instead, he's breaking American bourbon. That's a legacy he'll never be able to escape.